Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to open up the 11th annual Prague Conference on Political Economy. My name is Josef Šíma. I'm president of this school and also somebody who 11 years ago had an idea to organize an annual meeting of free market scholars. Scholars who do not only the Austrian School of Economics, but scholars who understand that there is some beauty in social organization which is more organic, more bottom-up, and they prefer the way how to do social sciences in such a way as well. Back then, I did my first PCPE with, at that time, a student of mine, Šimon Bilo, who later on actually got his PhD under the great Larry White of GMU and now is having an academic job in the United States, which actually means if anybody of you students in the audience want to have such a nice career, please join me in organizing the next 10 years of PCPE. There is some prize attached to it. In the past, we had great speakers, hundreds of them, some world-class economists, political scientists, or legal theorists. Just a few examples for those who didn't take time to read about the history of PCPE. We had people like Richard Epstein of University of Chicago, Guido Calabresi of Yale University Law School, Pete Boettke of GMU, Mike Munger of Duke University, and many others. Also, indeed, European scholars and professors, Jesus Huerta de Soto of Juan Carlos University in Madrid, Guido Hülsmann of the University of Angers, Bruno Frey of the University of Zurich, and several others. Simply what we want to do here in Prague, to have a platform for scholars, both respected academics and young students, PhD students, young researchers, who understand social sciences very broadly and who appreciate the free market flavor attached to it. This year we have over 30 papers to be presented. Technically, there is a shared drive where you can all upload your papers if you want other people to see it. In your conference brochure, you have the address by the registration desk. There are passwords if you want to be active users and really upload, not only read the files. So this is available. Indeed, there is Wi-Fi in this school, so I guess we have a nice environment for a very nice and productive conference. There are some people signed up for dinner today, so we'll be leaving at about 7 o'clock from this place. A list of those people who sign up is at the registration desk as well. All right, now about the place. This is Severo Institute, which is a small private college, university, where some 800 students study political science and international relations, law in business, economic policy, and public administration. We have a great, now very popular major in security studies, and several MPA and MBA programs as well. The standard programs are BA and MA level, and there is a hope of having a small PhD program on top of it. Also, within 1 year, we should open our first English master program, which is going to be a unique PPE, philosophy, politics, economics program taught in English, with some, actually, of the people I mentioned, the great theoreticians, professors from US universities being part of the program. So Mike Munger of Duke University will come annually and teach in this program, Pete Betke as well. David Schmitz of Arizona University also promised to participate. And we have a network of perhaps 10 European universities with professors. Many of those actually presented their papers at this conference in the past as well. So you see the ultimate goal, to have a program to which free market scholars will participate, will send their students. And I believe Prague and several institutes specifically can be a very unique place, not only in the Czech Republic, but in the whole of Europe. The school is 9 years old now. I was started by a think tank which is 19 years or 15 years old. The think tank originally provided weekend education for people who wanted to be successful in politics. They wanted to learn about non-socialist understanding of society. So there were courses and educational programs in political economy, in political philosophy, and several other fields. And after some 5 years of existence, the think tank started this school. So now we are a regular accredited small university, EU-style accreditation. The university, which has a very good local reputation and now is expanding internationally with some maybe 25 partner universities from Europe, but also China and US and Latin America. And we want to do more in this respect. So if some of you see a prospect of a possible cooperation between several institutes and your schools, please approach me during this conference. I'll be very happy to think about our mutually beneficial cooperation. And believe me, we as a small private school are very flexible. Okay, well, this is the introduction. You know all where you are. Perhaps you know a little bit of what to expect. And we can start the first part of the conference, which are our annual talks. The two annual talks are called after people whose life is associated with the city of Prague, Friedrich von Wieser and Franz Schuhel. So first to Wieser, whose name is connected to the first annual talk. Friedrich von Wieser, as many of you know, is the second generation of the Austrian School of Economics. He is a scholar who coined the term opportunity costs, and Friedrich von Wieser taught for years here in Prague and left Prague only to replace Karl Menger in Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century. The recipient of PCPE 2015, Friedrich von Wieser Prize, is our first speaker indeed, and that is William White, who is the chairman of the Economic Development and Review Committee at the OECD in Paris, and former member of the Executive Committee, which manages the Bank for International Settlement. Mr. White is known for his critical views of the mainstream approaches to understanding financial crisis and contemporary monetary policies. And indeed, he is a great scholar connected to the teaching of Friedrich August von Hayek, which is a very rare situation among people close to central banking. So now, Bill, please approach me to receive the PCPE 2015 Friedrich von Wieser Prize. Wait for the picture.
Let me begin by thanking Joseph for the invitation and for the honor of receiving this prize. I'm not sure that I could sort of say that I was a member of the professional Austrian school, but I would have to say that there are many things about the Austrian school that I've, from my own personal experience, found very attractive. And the concept of credit creation, malinvestments, excesses of various sorts arising from a fiat money system, that, it seems to me, is a profound insight. Of course, everybody's policies, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, everybody's monetary policies are sort of premised on a prior choice of an exchange regime. And that's really what I want to talk about, because I think there are many things about the exchange regimes that are out there that I don't like. And I'm reminded, it's a kind of joke about a guy who goes to a museum, and he says, I may not know much about art, but I know what I don't like. So my presentation is almost totally negative. And you may think there's something wrong with that, but I have in my hand the 1937 edition of Hayek's Monetary Nationalism and International Stability, where he's really talking about these sorts of questions. And he says here, this is on the last page, as he's looking for better rules of the game for the gold exchange standard, okay, better rules of the game. He says the most important step in this direction is that the rationale of an international standard and the true sources of the instability of our present system should be properly appreciated. So this whole book, in a certain way, was as it were, following the same kind of line. I'm going to tell you what it is that I don't like. Well, sorry, where are we? Well, okay, there we go. First point to start with is that we're in the middle of a huge mess. The global crisis that started in 2007 is continuing. It is the worst financial and global crisis that we've had since the 1930s. It is a crisis at the global level, and it is a crisis in the Eurozone. And my belief is that both of these crises have their origins in the same phenomenon, and that is, at the global level, there was an excess of credit granting by core countries in the advanced market economies, which then spread out to the peripheral economies, and we wound up with a kind of global liquidity problem. And when you think about Europe or the Eurozone, it's more or less the same kind of thing, which was there was far too much credit granted by the core countries, Germany, the Netherlands, France in particular, which then spread out to the periphery and, of course, caused huge, huge problems. And I will get to this at the end. Anybody who thinks that this thing is over is obviously not looking very carefully at the facts, because this crisis is not over, and it could manifest itself at the next stage in a variety of ways, and I will come back to that. The roots of this thing are in bad policy, I think, particularly bad monetary policy. But it's bad policy based on bad analytical tools and bad models. And maybe this is what endears me to the Austrian way of thinking. And I'm not talking here about little differences between monetarists and Keynesians, or little differences between the neoclassicals and the new Keynesian. I'm talking about a profound misunderstanding of how the whole system works. The models that people currently use, and I'll come back to this in the next slide, basically assume that the economy is a machine. It's not a machine. It's a forest. It's a complex, adaptive system which operates in a very different way. But just that simple insight that the basic model should be different has a lot of very important policy implications. And I would just note, then I will go on to talk about false beliefs, about how both the IMS, the International Monetary System, and the Eurozone operate, which I think have the potential to lead to a pretty disastrous ending. And I also, that'll be the sort of core of what I want to talk about. But I would just note here, if you want good public policies, there's three things that you have to have. First of all, the should problem. What should I do? You have to know what the right policy is. But that's not the only thing you need. You need to deal with the could problem. And the could problem is, do you have the power to do the things that you should do? And the last thing is the would problem. Right? Do you have the political will to exercise the power to do what you should do? Now, this lecture is basically all about the shoulds, but I just want to be clear that it's only one part of the problem that we have to deal with. Well, the first thing I want to say is that we really need to embrace complexity. Some of you may recall the line of Don Rumsfeld a number of years ago, American, I think, Secretary of Defense. And this brings you back to the philosophical basis of things, the epistemological basis of these things. Don Rumsfeld said, it's not the things that you don't know. Don Rumsfeld said, there are things we know we know. There are things we know we don't know. But there are things we don't know we don't know. And Mark Twain, and I got ahead of myself a little bit, said it much better about 100 years earlier when he said, it ain't the things that you don't know that get you. It's the things what you know for sure, what ain't so. So it's false beliefs. And holding on to those false beliefs can lead you into a lot of trouble. So I think it's a false belief to treat the economy as a machine. And above all, it's a mistake to treat the economy as a machine which is governable by the central banks. The idea that somehow these guys are smart enough, they can sort it all out. I've been in the business for 50 years, and I'm telling you, it ain't so. The real truth, and I think we got this initially in a sense from Hayek in his 1967 essay, which is called The Theory of Complex Phenomena, is that the economy is a complex adaptive system. And it is very interesting that there's a lot of interest recently in this. Now, with the new computing capacities, where Hayek could only tell a story when he wrote that essay. But now we've got the computing power, we've got the data that you can do these sort of ACE modeling, this agent-based computerized economic modeling that is absolutely fascinating. I've been to a number of meetings, and it really does strike me that there's a real way to make progress here. I spoke about the lessons from these, from just simply sort of treating the economy as a complex adaptive system. Some very simple lessons. One of them is these systems break down regularly. All these complex systems break down regularly, and they break down according to a power law. So that they're very frequent little crises and very infrequent business crises, but they're linked up by a power law. And the policy lesson is very simple. Be prepared. And when you think about the last crisis, we were totally unprepared. There was no deposit insurance, there were no bank insolvency laws. I could go on, but we were totally unprepared, and we should have been. The next thing, the trigger in complex systems for the breakdown is irrelevant. So what you want to focus on is not the trigger, but the system. So you want to start looking for evidence that maybe the system itself is on the verge of instability. Credit growth, property prices, things of that nature should be right at the center. Optimizing is impossible. We know too little. So focus on avoiding truly bad outcomes. Capital ratios for banks should be much higher. Okay? Complexity in the system that is not required should be stripped out. Okay, what they're trying to do with the Volcker rule and the changes in Europe and in the UK, if it's not needed, strip it out. The system is adaptive. It's a complex adaptive system. Don't fight the last war. Okay? The big crisis in Southeast Asia, for example, in the middle 1990s, was bank lending to corporates. Okay? So lots of effort has gone into worrying about that. The crisis that's coming is going to be non-bank lending to corporates. The numbers are very clear. There's been a massive explosion of this kind of stuff. The system is adaptive. Don't fight the last war. And unfortunately, the policymakers have done very little of the above. The paradigm shift has not taken place. And you can ask why. And I think the answer can be found in very large part in Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Takes ages and ages before paradigm shift occurs, even when all the evidence is just accumulating and accumulating. It took 100 years after Copernicus wrote his book. I can't remember the title, but the one that said the sun is in the center, not the earth. It took 100 years before it became widely accepted, and even then not totally accepted. There's a line from Niels Bohr. It's attributed to Niels Bohr. It says, "Science advances funeral by funeral." The old guys won't give it up. They have to die first, and then the younger people who've got sort of a broader, who are less sort of prejudiced, step in. And I sort of think that's going on. And I would note Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist from Harvard, he says that paradigm shifts are even harder in the middle of a crisis. So you'd think that in the middle of a crisis, when your beliefs were really challenged, that you would say, I must go back and think again. Kahneman says the very opposite happens. Everybody simply retreats into the old belief system. And that's why, in a sense, when you look at what's going on in Europe, the Germans have retreated back into the problem is big deficits, hyperinflation, and the Americans have retreated back into the problem is the Great Depression, and we must do everything we can to avoid it. So these are really important things, and the change has not occurred yet. Well, let me say a few words about choosing an exchange rate system as a prior to starting to conduct your monetary policies. Why do we have to choose an exchange rate system? I think, as the first bullet says, it's the reality of what they call the impossible trinity, which is you cannot have a floating exchange rate, free capital flows, and an autonomous monetary policy all at the same time. It just, you've got to give up either one, or you've got to somehow constrain all three, but you can't have all three. So the interesting thing about it is that as people have been forced to make these exchange rate choices, the choice made at the level of the international monetary system, or at least the G3, has been the very opposite of the choice that's been made within Europe. So whereas the G3 have decided to float, the Eurozone basically has gone to immutable fixing, okay, which is really the very other end of the spectrum. You can't alter the exchange rate in the Eurozone, and there's no provisions for leaving. So some of you may know, remember the song from the 60s, Hotel California, okay, where you can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. That's the way it is in the Eurozone. And you have to ask yourself the question of why have they gone in these different directions? And I guess one answer is when you, and I did this many times in Canada, when you say float or fix, there's always an enormous number of things that you can put under the pro side for fixing. But there's also all sorts of costs associated with it. So you've got a big list. And you have to make a judgment about what's better. And of course, the character of the pros and cons can change over time. So that in some fundamental sense, there's no right answer. But one of the things that strikes me is that again, choices get driven by the biases or the preferences, if you want to put it that way, of the people making the choice. So the Americans basically like floating because floating gives them freedom to pursue short-term growth. And the Germans, I think, prefer fixing because fixing provides the discipline that gives you sustained growth. Now, both these things are good things. Strong growth is good and sustained growth is good. The question is, well, what's your preference? So you can see here that there's sort of no real right answer. And I guess there's another indication that there's no real right answer with these things, is that these exchange rate systems, whether floating or fixed, the prevailing system has broken down repeatedly throughout time. So if you want to talk about going from fixed to floating, we had the breakdown of the gold standard, we had the breakdown of Bretton Woods, we had the breakdown of the European monetary system. But conversely, if you want to talk about going from floating to fixed, they tried to reestablish the gold standard in the interwar period. They did introduce the Bretton Woods system. After the Bretton Woods system had broken down, we had that period of time, it's often referred to as from the Plaza to the Louvre, where they tried to stem down the sort of the appreciation of the US dollar. And then it started to appreciate too much, so they had to sort of buoy it back up again. But all incidents of, fixed on the one hand, floating on the other, and both have got their benefits. Well, I guess the question then arises is, why did these things break down, all these systems at various times? I think it was in part because the systems themselves weren't robust enough, and in part they weren't robust enough because people had false beliefs about what you needed to sustain them. And my worry at the moment is that there's a lot of those false beliefs floating around. And let me repeat just a few of them. Let me start with the international monetary system. To be fair, I think what I would say is that when I talk about false beliefs in this regard, I'm really sort of talking about false beliefs held by Americans. And in a sense, these false beliefs really amount to a set of arguments for maintaining the current dollar exchange standard and the exorbitant privilege that goes with having the dollar as still the international reserve currency. Or to put it another way, it's a set of false beliefs that says the Americans don't have to worry about having a current account deficit that secularly just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They don't have to worry about it. Well, what are these false beliefs? I guess the first one is that if exchange rate float, this will automatically cure the global current account imbalances. And my feeling, and shared by Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa and a number of other people who really were scholars, is that just simply is not true. When exchange rates float, they often float in the wrong direction. So that a country may have a current account deficit, but instead of its exchange rate going down, it often goes up. Second reason is that when the exchange rate does move in the right direction, very frequently the sort of shift that should be occurring from the tradables to non-tradables just simply doesn't occur. So I'll give you a recent example. In both Japan and in the case of Britain, where the yen and the pound have gone down a lot. And there's been, until very recently in Japan, no visible response. And the third thing is that about this being false, about exchange rates floating, is that in the current system, there's absolutely nothing to prevent people with big current account deficits taking steps that will make that deficit even worse. So you think about the U.S. in 2009, where they had the biggest fiscal stimulus of any of the countries, okay? Even though they started off from having the biggest current account deficit. Another example, I guess, going in the opposite way, would be Germany in the course of the last few years. Germany's got the biggest current account surplus in the world right now, and in addition has met its fiscal restraint targets even earlier than it was legally required to do. And now, in addition, we've got QE to boot, okay, pushing down the euro. All of this with a country that's got a huge current account surplus. So this exchange rates float, it'll cure the imbalances. It's just not true. Second thing, belief, and you hear this from the Americans all the time, if exchange rates float, U.S. monetary policy will have no spillover effects. I think this is just palpably untrue. If you look at the correlations now between asset prices, interest rates, growth rates across countries, they've been going up and up and up. Okay? So that what happens at the core gets transmitted almost automatically to the periphery. And in addition to the price signal, you get these massive capital movements coming from the core countries to the peripheral countries, which also creates problems on the way in and on the way out. The third issue is if the U.S. has got price stability, it will stabilize the global system so that everything's going to be fine. That, too, is palpably false. Having price stability doesn't even guarantee the absence of macro problems in the country that's got price stability. And I remind you to think about the Great Depression. There was no inflation prior to the Great Depression. I invite you to think about Japan in the 1980s. There was no inflation in Japan in the 1980s. There was no inflation in Southeast Asia prior to their big crisis. Okay? So the fact is that price stability is a desirable thing, but it does not guarantee broader macroeconomic stability. And as I noted earlier, this massive sort of credit expansion in the advanced market economies, particularly the U.S., has now spread out all across the world. In large part, I shouldn't say in large part, but in part it has been due to the fact that many of the emerging market economies, to say nothing of the Swiss, chose to more or less peg their exchange rates to countries that were suffering from massive domestic credit expansion and imbalances. So it's not just the advanced countries that have got blame to accept. It's some of the emerging market countries too. And the last false belief, I guess, is that if global crises can't happen, then there's no need to prepare for them. And as I suggested earlier, in large part, that's sort of where we are, is we were not prepared for the crisis. And looking forward, we're not prepared to cope with another crisis or an extension of the old crisis. Our macro weapons now are almost totally used up. In terms of crisis management, we have no international lender of last resort. You know, if Italy gets into trouble, we are all in trouble. There is no international lender of last resort. And in terms of crisis resolution, sort of writing off the debts and all of that, that's going to be almost impossible too, because we haven't yet solved the problem of too big to fail. So we've got a lot of issues out there, and they all emanate, I think, from false beliefs. We have a similar set of problems in Europe. And I would have to say that I think these are problems that probably affect more core Europe than they do the peripheral. But let me just, for the sake of argument, let me just sort of throw these things out. And these false beliefs have to do with two things. One of them is with crisis prevention, and the other one has to do with crisis management and resolution. With respect to crisis prevention, I guess the first false belief was that the Eurozone was immutable and that therefore the currency risk had disappeared and therefore there was no need to worry about growing current account imbalances. That in a sense, because of the immutability of the exchange rate relationship, the currency risk had disappeared. So there was no problem. And during the period of time that those beliefs were widely held, of course, there was a huge flow of capital from the center countries to the peripheral countries. And then at a certain point, people realized, around the time of the Greek crisis, people began to realize that the currency risk had gone away, but the counterparty risk had not gone away. And it was at that point that people realized that they really had an exposure and it was time to cut and run. And that's when you had this sudden stop in the capital flows into these emerging markets and subsequently a massive reversal to the point where almost the internationalization of the Eurozone has been almost totally reversed. And I don't have enough time to go into the details of that, but there are lots of reasons why that flow of capital into the peripheral has reversed. One of them is fears about the banking sovereign nexus in the peripheral countries. Another one is fears about the solvency of banks at the core, so banks want to protect themselves. Regulators, I think, who've been pushing core banks to bring the money back home again. And lastly, and I advise you to watch your newspapers on this one, the last thing is the depositors in the peripheral countries, who when they start to worry about whether the Eurozone will hang together, then you'll start to see big movements. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some of that in the next few days coming out of Greece at least, and maybe even Cyprus. And the third sort of false belief with respect to crisis prevention, the Europeans bought in the same way as the Americans did to the idea, and indeed all the central bankers, and I had 15 years at the BIS watching all these people on a daily, monthly basis, they all bought into the story that if you had price stability, everything else would be fine. And the fact of the matter, it's just not true. Let's move on to crisis management and resolution, where again it seems to me that we've got some issues here. The crisis began in Greece, and Greece really did have a fiscal problem. I hope there's no Greek people here that I will insult, but I mean, in terms of the structural basis of that economy, I mean, Greece is truly unique and uniquely bad. And they really did have a problem with fiscal excess. But I think the difficulty was that it was then assumed somehow that everybody had a fiscal problem and that fiscal restraint everywhere was the necessary policy response. And my own view was that this is a misdiagnosis, that it was fundamentally a balance of payments problem. And of course, the fiscal austerity, there's no doubt that the size of the multipliers is much greater than people expected at the beginning, in large part because there were so many countries doing austerity at the same time. A second issue is the question of who needs to adjust. And this brings us back to Bretton Woods, and these are the same issues that keep coming up over and over again. Who should do the adjusting in a balance of payments situation? Well, if it's interpreted as a fiscal problem, then there's more grounds for saying it's the debtors. But if you interpret it from a balance of payments perspective, then really what one says is, well, the creditors could do a lot too. I mean, the creditors could expand demand to help solve a balance of payments problem. Creditors could reform, as I think in the German case, reform the services sector to open it up, to liberalize, to put less emphasis on exports. So there's things that can be done. Debt forgiveness for sovereigns is not an option. The fact of the matter, as Herb Stein once said, if the debt is unsustainable, it will stop. So if some of the debts out there cannot be paid, they will not be paid. The only choice is whether they will not be paid in an orderly way or whether they'll not be paid in a disorderly way. And lastly, or not lastly, but this other thing I've got here, banking systems are healthy and resolution is unnecessary. I'm thinking particularly about core banks. My own personal view, and this is all purely personal, is that the biggest mistake that was made in Europe when the crisis started, and I can certainly see the arguments pro and con concerns, the biggest mistake made was to bail out the banks. And by failing to resolve the banking problem, the problem of banking loans within the Eurozone as a whole, including the core, we've wound up with banks that are still not sure that they're solvent, and they're going to be more wary of making loans than they would otherwise be, and that is not helpful economically. But personally, and this is a very personal view, I think that that was such a mistake because by letting the banks get away from taking the losses, the allocation of the losses subsequently is now framed as being between the Greek taxi drivers and the German taxpayers. And this is absolutely the last thing that we want to have, because there's now an absence of trust when the Eurozone fundamentally needs trust between all of the parties to build the monetary union, to build the banking union, to build the fiscal union, and that trust has been dissipated. I think that's been a... And lastly, and it's implicit in all the other stuff about cross-border burden sharing, there has been a lot of cross-border burden sharing, okay? I mean, and we all know this, the Target 2 system, but there's all sorts of other ways in which the Germans and others have paid huge sums of money. But it's always been done in a hesitant way that has created, I think, a sense of the policymakers being behind the ball, and they're in a situation where they can be easily attacked. I'm getting close to the end here. The role of the ECB. The ECB has had to face two huge problems, and I don't envy them in the slightest. One of them is the ECB represents one of the biggest economic zones in the world. So they're intimately involved in the global liquidity crisis. And what can they do to play their role? And again, like all of the other central banks, they responded very vigorously to respond to the financial failures in early 2008 and 2009. And they've done all sorts of other things to try to stimulate demand. They have been, I think, true to their roots, less aggressive than the Fed has been, because they've always worried in the back of their mind that maybe aggressive central bank action could wind up in inflation. And it could. It could. I mean, these are justifiable concerns. The Americans have been more aggressive because their big worry is avoiding the repeat of the Great Depression. The role of the ECB in this Eurozone crisis has also been pervasive. They've done all sorts of things. I mean, we've got lender of last resort to individual banks. We've got lending via the national central banks, purchases of sovereign bonds. And finally, Mario Draghi's statement that he'd do whatever it takes. But you know, the point is that it was a highly conditional, I won't go into the details, but it's a highly conditional, and it's never actually been used. And there's still a real problem that if it ever were to be used, it would be revealed as just a huge bluff, because there's not much actually he can do, much less whatever it takes. So my conclusion, and this is the last bullet here, is that anybody who believes that the ECB will sort it out, it's a totally false belief. That it's okay to buy time in the short run within the Eurozone. But over the longer run, what the Eurozone has to do is they've got to do all of those other things that I suggested. The longer run structural stuff, the banking reform, or the banking union, the economic union, the fiscal union, the political union, in the end. How far you go down each one of those paths, I don't know, but my view is that if we want to avoid future crises of confidence, that the Euro people have got to make those decisions. Okay, well, this is my last slide. Where's this all going to end? Another crisis at the global level? I think it's entirely possible. As I say, we have a situation now where debt levels globally are now 20% higher than they were in 2007. So if you think about a crisis period as being a period for deleveraging, we've done the very opposite. And most of the increase in the leverage has been in the emerging market economies. So that in a certain sense, the situation's even worse than in 2007. Because in 2007, the emerging markets were part of the solution. And now in 2015, they're part of the problem. And everywhere I look, and I won't go into any details on this, I can see possible trigger points to unstick this complex adaptive system of the international economy. China is in the process of a big transition. Transitions are always dangerous. Japan, I think Abenomics is going to backfire. The commodity producers are in trouble. The U.S. has got difficulties. There's triggers everywhere. And in the Eurozone, and you know this, you're closer to it even than I am, there are plenty of opportunities still for things to go wrong in the Eurozone, and Grexit is just one of them. So both short run and long run, there's all sorts of reasons why the confidence might yet still disappear. Going back again to my thoughts about complex adaptive system, the whole world is just one big complex adaptive system. And the reality with globalization and the rest of it is if you get another crisis in the Eurozone, it will affect the whole world. And the IMF and the OECD have done some pretty careful calculations on this stuff. And the results are not pretty. If there were to be a repeat of the 2009 financial crisis, it would take 3 percentage points off world GDP, 5 percentage points off European GDP. Now, these are all model simulations and worth what they're worth, okay? But the numbers are big. And if Europe could affect the world by exactly the same token, if something goes seriously wrong in China, okay, it will affect everybody else, including all the people in this world, or in this room. So, we have a lot of problems out there. My own personal belief is that it has to do with false beliefs on the part of many people about exchange rate regimes and what they can deliver. And I think there's a lot of room for reform. My last bullet, can anyone possibly have any idea? I started with a reference to Hayek, and I'll finish with a reference to Hayek. His 1974 Nobel lecture was called The Pretense of Knowledge. And his conclusion was we couldn't possibly understand where any of this stuff will wind up. My own personal view is that it will end up badly. The only good news would be that if it does end up badly, there might at last be some incentives for people who are in positions of authority to say that the exchange rate systems that we have are broken and they need to be fixed. And I hope that will in fact happen. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. So the floor is open for questions from the audience. And the microphone is available. All right, 1 and 2.
So I would like to ask you, So where do you think it is really going? Like with all this meddling into the monetary systems, with all this systematically sort of corrupt system in the first place, where do we have to go to move on? That's exactly your last question. So I would like to ask you. You left it open. Where is it going?
This is pure speculation. We all know that if or at least this audience would know that if you do have massive expansion of the monetary base at a global level, and that's precisely what we've seen, on an extended period, the end of this has got to be higher inflation. And the paths to that can be very different. I used to say that this thing will either end in deflation or inflation. And then I read Peter Bernholz's book. Some people here, he's the world's expert really on hyperinflations. And Peter basically says, you can have a big debt overhang as we currently have that leads you into a deflationary period. But then what you really have to watch out for is the fiscal side. And if you've got countries that go into this deflationary period that are already running big fiscal deficits and they have big debts, sovereign debts, then you have a real problem because the government has a big deficit and it needs the money to pay the salaries of the of the government and the pensioners and whatever. But nobody will lend them the money because the stock of debt is too big. And then they have to go back into the central bank. And then when you start thinking about MV equals PT, the M starts to explode and the V starts to explode as the demand for money collapses. System totally nonlinear. And all of a sudden something that looks very benign becomes very dangerous. My own personal view, and it's totally personal, is I'd look out for Japan. Japan is a highly idiosyncratic country, I know that, but Japan has got a government deficit of debt of 250% of GDP. The government deficit is 7.5% of GDP. They have no plan to correct this. They need a swing in the primary balance to stabilize the debt-to-GNI ratio of 14 percentage points of GDP. This may or may not happen. And if it doesn't happen, we have a problem. And for those of you who read the standard literature as well as the Austrian literature, you may remember Sargent and Wallace from 1981, I think it's called, Some Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic. And that's precisely what it's all about. That the central bank might even try to tighten up, but because the debt service explodes as the interest rates go up on this huge stock of debt, that people then start to worry about fiscal dominance and the whole thing comes unstuck. And that would be my big worry. I mean, that's sort of almost where the arithmetic takes you. May not happen for years. I mean, no idea. And as Hayek would have said, not only do we not know, we can't know. But you can see the end game. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that lecture. I certainly agree there were many false assumptions before the last financial crisis. I had a question regarding the choice of exchange regimes. You gave a really great explanation of why European countries and the U.S. choose the regimes that they do. I was interested in hearing your thoughts on China's exchange regime problem and whether there is a role for OECD countries and I suppose other countries in the world to pressure China to change its exchange regime given Japan's experience when it was pressured.
Very interesting and very topical question. At the moment, it should be recognized how much the renminbi's actually gone up. Okay? And in a way, this is consistent with two longer-term objectives that the Chinese are seeking. The Chinese in the past had a process basically of household income suppression in order to make available resources for investment, exports, and growth. Right? And so what they did was they kept the exchange rate down so the consumer didn't get the terms of trade benefit. They kept wages down, and they had financial repression. And they're clearly moving away from that. So they're letting the exchange rate go up, and they've stated that they want to put the purchasing power back in the hands of the consumer. Exchange rate's going up, wages are going up, financial repression is being removed. So higher renminbi is consistent with that goal. It's also consistent with China's goal of getting into the SDR. And I think there's going to be a decision on this sometime in the fall. I could be wrong, but I think it's in the fall they're going to make the decision. And China really wants to be on the inside as opposed to the outside for all sorts of reasons. Longer term, perhaps, this is part of replacing the dollar. Who knows? But this is what they want to do. All of this argues for a stronger renminbi. And it has been going up. But the other side of it, as you know, is that they've lost a lot of competitiveness, and there'll be huge amounts of pressure inside the party, particularly for the people that have been making huge sums of money. And there's been an explosion of billionaires in China, right? That they're all in the party. So there's going to be a big intra-party battle about whether the renminbi should go up or down. And as to who's going to win that battle, I couldn't possibly tell you. It's all inside. It's an enigma inside a, what did Churchill say? A mystery wrapped inside an enigma. No idea. But those are the issues.
Thank you very much. All right, we started with Hayek. Where else to go than to Mises and Rothbard? So I'd like to call to the podium Dominik Stroukal, president of Ludwig von Mises Institute, Czech Republic, Slovakia, to take responsibility over the book launch, because we are here also to celebrate the first translation of Murray Rothbard's, how's it called? Manifesto, what's the name? Manifesto of Liberty. Dominik, the floor is now yours.
So, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you. I'm here to thank you for the wonderful response you have accorded the launch of this book, of this magnificent book. I have it here. And I hope it will be even on the presentation. It was truly amazing. If I remember it correctly, it was only a few weeks and you were able to fundraise more than 120,000 Czech crowns for this book. So it was more than double, it was more than twice than what we needed. And I think that the book deserves it. I remember that it was actually Murray Rothbard and his Ethics of Liberty, or maybe it was not him. Before him, it was Mojmír Hampel at one of his lectures at the University of Economics, and he's here. I want to thank him because he mentioned once, and I remember it now when I saw him, that he mentioned that there may be a possibility of a world without a central bank. I said something like, who can be that crazy? And he mentioned explicitly Dan Šťastný, he's here too. I said, if Dan can think about a world without a central bank, then it may not be such a stupid idea. So I went to a library and I bought Ethics of Liberty by Murray Rothbard, and it changed my life. And it was exactly him who brought me to the whole movement of liberty, the whole, or let's say to the Mises Institute, to Students for Liberty, to Severin Institute and Joseph Schima, and eventually to all of you. So I hope that this book will do the same to hundreds of other people. I want to thank you. I want to thank to all of you who participated in the project. I want to thank especially to our major donors, which is Honza Mašek. He's not here. he's in England, I guess, to Mojmír Hampel and to Honza Kuželka. He will say some words after me. Then I want to thank to Jakub and Lucie for that you can read the book in proper Czech. And to Bara for, you can see it here, but I recommend you to buy it or at least to see it right there, because we have very beautiful cover for the book. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and enjoy the book. And I'd like to invite Honza, I can see him here, to say some words. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. You're one of the first ones that I would like to thank today. Without you, without the whole Mises Institute, Czech Republic and Slovakia, this whole thing wouldn't be done. I'm very happy because this book is a translation of my first English book that I read, and it was not far from here, actually, Library of Liberální Institute. There are three people I would like to thank for bringing me there, inviting me there, and that's Dan Šťastný, David Lipka, and Josef Šíma. I remember all these discussions, lectures, seminars there, and one day I just came there, found this library, and I believe Josef recommended this book to me. It was much thinner, actually, and smaller than this one. I don't know why. I hope you guys have all the words in there. I love the book. It influenced me a lot, and I think the book is written in a very understandable language, which was at that time, 20 years ago, when I was a newbie at the college, very important. What I found interesting, there was some points that I was like, I never thought about it this way. On the other hand, sure, I thought this way, but they don't do it this way. There are several topics like, oh my God, roads, healthcare, welfare state, social care, all kind of fields that, even though the book was written so many years ago, they still would work, I would say. At the end, Rothbard is talking about future of freedom, strategy of bringing freedom, which I find also very important. For me, this is a little celebration. I was very glad that you guys gave me the chance to support the translation and publishing of this book, and I was quite happy that I could support it as a #1 online donor. I'd like to ask Mr. Šíma to come here and tell us a few words, because as a #1 online donor, I was actually given the chance to choose the author of the foreword in the book, and I chose the best teacher of mine, and that's Mr. Šíma. So if you could please tell us a few words about this book, and let's then come to the point.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you. I'm humbled. That was not part of the plan. I didn't know about myself being the best teacher. I'm indeed glad, and it pleases me. First, Jan mentioned the Library of Liberální Institute. It's actually here next door. The Library of Liberální Institute moved to Severo Institute, as well as the library of another old Czech think tank, the Civic Institute. So Severo Institute is now becoming a sort of umbrella free market organization, which I guess is very good because it makes the point stronger, and it's very fine that we actually cooperate, unlike many free market institutions elsewhere in the world. So the library is available, and I hope it will convert many other people and influence the way they think about a free society. Indeed, I'm not ready to sum up the book. The book covers a lot of topics, and what is fascinating, and Jan mentioned it, that it's actually an old book, but when you read it, it's like giving you arguments to false ideas which you've heard like yesterday in the evening news. And that makes it very fascinating. The arguments show how beautiful science economics is, and political philosophy of freedom, that the ideas are timeless. And I was very happy to write an introduction. I guess the noise you have just said was a signal that the champagne is opened, and we can have a toast. And I just wish the book a lot of readers. And I'm very glad that, historically, I was the one who started translating Rothbard maybe 10, 15 years ago. And suddenly there is someone else who does it, and I can only, get the book, write an introduction, and enjoy reading it. It's a major progress in my professional career. So, thank you guys from the Mises Institute for doing it, and you have my full support for projects like this and events based on books and summer schools and conferences. I hope we will work together for many, many years. So thanks a lot.
May I please ask Wimir to join us for one glass of champagne? Thank you. As one of the major donors.
Long live Rothbard. I have to get the right picture here. Okay, let's move to the second memorial talk, which is named after semi or maybe fully forgotten Czech economist Franz Čuhel, who actually contributed substantially to economic theory. He was the guy who studied under Böhm-Bawerk, and when he wrote in German his book, which is called On the Theory of Needs, it made quite an influence, and many famous economists such as Lutsky or Robbins made references to the book. Indeed, Ludwig von Mises made references to the book, and Murray Rothbard called the approach to utility, to ordinal utility, Mises' Čuhel theory of utility. So this lecture is to commemorate the achievements of Franz Schuhel. Well, to properly do it, we have our second keynote speaker, who is Michael Wohlgemuth, who is director of Open Europe Berlin and professor of political economy at the University of Witten-Herdecke, which is a great private German university. Michael has been professor of international governance at the University of Bayreuth, managing research associate at the Walter Eucken Institute in Freiburg, also research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Economics in Jena, affiliate assistant professor at George Mason University and New York University, and Friedrich August von Hayek professor at the University of Innsbruck. His main research fields are new institutional economics, Austrian economics indeed, public choice, and the history of ideas. Michael, please approach me to receive the Franz Schuhel 2015 prize. The floor is all yours.
Wow, that looks great. Thank you very much, Josef, for this wonderful prize and the opportunity to come to Prague from Berlin, which is a beautiful train ride. And so I'm very happy to be here. And I can't really tell you much to really commemorate Mr. Schuhel. I'm not a real expert in his work, but I'm quite sure he was a wonderful man. Now let's see how we can do that. Perhaps a little bit like that, because I have to have a look at this. I don't need these notes here. You know that Lord Acton was saying power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But I still sometimes use it and need it. It's sometimes a rather elegant way to present your ideas. For those who like to read big books and great works, this is pretty much the whole background of my argument. As you can see, Buchanan Tullock, this classic calculus of consent. Also Jim Buchanan's theory of clubs, and some more empirical work by the Alesina School, and the combination of these things, club theory, the calculus of consent, and the European Union. This is what I try to do in this lecture, which is rather rare, but a colleague of mine, Renate Ohr, and some colleagues have done a similar thing, and Clara Brandi and one of her co-authors have also done something like that, Europe à la carte. Sounds like a dinner speech, but we're not there yet. But so if you feel very hungry and need to go out and have something to eat right now, just 2 minutes, and then you get the basic message of my whole presentation, which is like that. It is quite obvious that within the European Union, after enlargement and after the introduction of the common currency, we see much more heterogeneity between the different countries. And that leads to increased decision-making costs, but also preference costs or external costs. So if you take a common decision for the European Union as a whole, the likelihood that some countries would have to accept a collective decision that they would not have taken on their own also increases. So this one-size-fits-all costs should also increase, and the costs to make any kinds of decisions. And that implies, secondly, that the larger clubs, the enlargement of the European Union and the deepening of the European Union both become more costly. And it's quite amazing that both happened at the same time over the last decades, which also needs some explanation. And I conclude that it becomes more and more reasonable to think about some ways to have some flexible integration, flexible deepening, flexible enlargement of specific countries in specific policy areas where they might agree. So some kind of not Europe, multi-speed Europe, but also a multi-direction Europe. And, people in Brussels hate that when I present these ideas, but I still think they are right, in a way, economically right. They are extremely naive, as you will see later on, but, as very often, it's very hard to be a good European as an economist and also be known as a good European or accepted as a good European. And so flexible enlargement and deepening, there are different models. I can show you some of them. The ideal typical kind of model that I would like to propose, because it's, to me, it makes economic sense. It doesn't make much political sense, but would be to really think about, do we need all this acquis communautaire, the common rules for every single of these 500 million people in Europe? How can we reduce it to a common core like free trade and so on? And for the rest, have some arrangements of more flexible voluntary association of nation states. And some of this is quite likely to happen, but certainly not the reduction of the acquis communautaire. This is the status quo. Can hardly be changed. This is what we have learned from European history. For the first observation, it's quite obvious to see the heterogeneity within the European Union. If you look at GDP per capita and you take the European Union average as 100, you can see that in Luxembourg you have more than 2.5 times higher GDP per capita, whereas Bulgaria has less than half of that. I also added the Czech numbers. They should be around 82% of the EU 28 average, which is already, I think, quite an achievement. Unemployment, you see the differences. Meanwhile, Germany is the best performing economy when it comes to labor markets. Unemployment is at 5%. In many areas of Germany, we have a rather drastic lack of skilled employment. We are really looking for skilled labor from other countries. Quite the opposite is true, as you know, for Greece, where the numbers are somewhere above 25%. And if you look at youth unemployment, it's completely desperate situation. Czech Republic 6.1. The Eurozone has an even worse performance than the EU as a whole when it comes to employment. The same is true for public debt. Whoever thought that the Eurozone, where you really have to qualify because you're a good, strong economy, the Eurozone on average performs worse than the EU as a whole. And the differences are tremendous. 10.5%, this is not the deficit, it's the overall debt number as a share of GDP for Estonia. Greece is somewhere around 180%, and the Czech Republic, if these numbers are right, is in pretty good shape compared to most other economies with something slightly above 40%. But it's not just economic data, it's also what people think, what their preferences are, what they think the European Union should do. And here you see also, in all the polls, you see that, people want different things from the EU, and people have different visions of what the EU really should do. When it comes to the question, would you favor or oppose giving more decision-making power to the EU? It's the good old Germans who say, we want to be Europeans, and everything that sounds European is fine with us. We are not nationalists anymore. And that's a rather historical kind of attitude, but a strong attitude. Whereas, of course, the usual suspects are the Brits, who don't want to be ruled by what they call the continent. And also, perhaps as a consequence of the crisis, EU skepticism is quite high in Greece. In the Czech Republic, perhaps as a consequence of your former president, who was not all too happy with the European Union, as I remember. And certainly you see some differences there. And also, when it comes to one of the key questions, economic policy questions, on the domestic side as well, question is here, what is the best way for the government to solve our country's economic problems? Spend more money to stimulate the economy, or reduce government spending to reduce the public debt? That is a poll taken in 2013. Greece wants to spend more money because they don't have any, but they want to spend more other people's money, of course. In Germany, austerity is much more popular and prevalent, and what is quite amazing is that people in France say a government should not spend more money, but, keep its books balanced, which is something that the classe politique in France perhaps hasn't understood. At least these numbers are surprising, but the only thing I want to prove with these polls is an obvious observation that people in different European states have different political preferences, right? And as you see, still the European Union, and I think it was a great success that the European Union had this enlargement towards countries like the Czech Republic. I think European Union enlargement as a whole was politically necessary, it was a moral obligation, and also an economic success. Not all the way, but still, I'm happy to be able to travel from Berlin to Prague without border controls and all that. This is certainly quite an achievement. What is strange, though, is that at the same time, when we had this development of a European Union of 6 member states to one now with 28 member states, the amount of legislation for all of the European member states has also increased dramatically. The so-called acquis communautaire, the whole body of directives, legislations, and whatever is being produced in Brussels and has to be adopted by each single member state before it can become member, has also increased dramatically. The present estimation is that, depending on the language, of course, the number of pages of this acquis communautaire is around 250,000 pages. This is the kinds of directives and laws that every single government member state has to translate into its own beautiful language and then also put into national legislation. And as a consequence, I think I'm a great believer in European diversity. This is certainly a very Hayekian idea, if you like, or Popperian idea as well. And I can't believe that one size fits all. And there must be increasing costs, and you can observe that, of finding consensus, as long as we stick to the anonymity rule in the Council. And there must also be increasing costs of neglecting different preferences in different parts of the EU if you then take qualified majority decisions. And for those who think an economist needs PowerPoints, but also, models, here you have Buchanan and Tulloch's model of interdependence costs. And there are just simply a combination of decision-making costs, and what they call external costs. So N, this would be from 0 to large N, would be just the amount of votes you need to take a decision, right? Anonymity, where everyone has to agree, is the right end, and at the left end it would be, someone can take a decision for everyone. And the logic is rather clear that the further you go to the right side, decision-making costs increase because a single member of a club or of a collective has a veto right. You have to convince really everyone before you can take a decision. And at the same time, of course, the external costs of someone having to accept a collective decision without being able to oppose it or veto it, then is at its maximum, at its minimum there. And this is the simple logic, and then if you combine the two, if you add these two costs, then you would find what is the optimum decision rule. And the smart thing, Jim Buchanan and Tullock, the argument they were making there is it is not necessarily the simple majority rule which is the best rule. It really depends on how you weigh decision-making costs and these external costs. Now, the simple thing is what happens if heterogeneity amongst the members of a group increases. Well, both the decision-making costs increase and the external costs increase. That is pretty obvious, but it's not obvious what really follows for the definition of the optimum decision-making rule. It can be shifting to the right or to the left, again depending on how you weigh decision-making costs or the needs of taking a decision, or external costs or the risks of having to accept a collective decision that you do not like or your citizens do not like. Now, this is, as I say, as a consequence of mostly European enlargement, heterogeneity increased, and this is why decision-making costs increased and external costs increased. But in the Brussels bubble, of course, people were only looking at these decision-making costs and saying, with 28, we need to change the rules. We have to go to more qualified majority decision-making. This whole kind of heterogeneity is something we don't like. We have to fight this by using thinking about how we can create something like a European identity and how to increase the absorption capacity of the old members. We have to homogenize and harmonize Europe because, this is what makes Europe strong, if we are all pretty much the same. The Hayekian Austrian evolutionary economics perspective would go pretty much the other way around. It would say, no, diversity is a wonderful thing, we should embrace that. And if we look back at European history, like in the book by Eric Jones, The European Miracle, it has been all these many kinds of different principalities and kingdoms and republics that were close to their citizens that had to fight also for where to establish markets, where the merchants would go to establish their business. And this is how, by some kind of an invisible hand of institutional competition, a more free, a more market-oriented rules emerged in Europe. And so heterogeneity is quite an asset and not a threat, historically speaking, for a continent. It creates the more comparative advantages of trade and competition, as I said, and at the same time it produces greater disadvantages of uniform regulation in many cases. So from an evolutionary Hayekian perspective, I would say let's rather decentralize or re-decentralize. Let's have not as many qualified majority decisions in the European Union, and let's seek for more options for flexible integration of the willing and capable members of the European Union. That's what I'm getting at, indeed. I will skip this because it's a little bit boring neoclassical economics, but and the main point can be made without showing where the optimum size of a club is depending on its number of members. There are decreasing costs if you share the costs of producing the club good. And at first, with every new member, there's economies of scale. But then, if you have a tennis club and there's only this one court, and on Saturday afternoon 20 people want to play, you have this kind of crowding phenomenon, and then the club size might have become too large. Still, there are benefits and costs of a larger union. And the chances or the benefits of European integration, obviously, is of having decisions, policies taken on a European and not a national or local level, could be economies of scale in the production and in the use of political goods. It can become easier to internalize border-crossing externalities. But on the other side, you have these costs, and these are the costs of heterogeneity, of preferences, as Alessina puts it, and it's both the external costs and the decision-making costs that increase. So what can we do to get out of this impasse, in a way? My idea is the European Union is a club. They accept members or they do not accept members. But there are so many different club goods that the EU provides. And all these different club goods, in theory and in a way also in practice, have different optimum sizes of membership components. Take the single market club in a very limited sense as a simple free trade zone, right? What is the optimum amount of members in a free trade club? It is infinity, right? Every new member contributes to the utility of those who are already members, and in that sense, as a free trade zone, the European Union is too small. It should be the whole planet, as most of the trade literature tells you, and if we find life on Mars, they should also be members of the European Union as a free trade zone. I mean, that's, to me, quite obvious, and the division of labor is limited by the size of the market, as Adam Smith said. So there, from an economic point of view, free trade should be, every reasonable country should become a member of this club. If we look at how the single market then is defined and how much of the acquis communautaire still comes under the flag of single market, I think the optimum club size does become finite. If you look at the policies like consumer protection, standards, norms, tax agreements that all seem to be necessary to have a well-functioning single market in the eyes of the legislators in Brussels, then, you have a certain amount of compliance costs, of demands on the bureaucracies in the different member states, and there perhaps, I would say, external costs become positive, decision-making costs get more and more important, and this is being reduced because the EU Commission, when it comes to trade issues and single market issues, can do a lot on its own. But then if the Commission and the European Court of Justice, by the way, if they take decisions for the single market, then there's also a high danger that they do not really take into account the different preferences in different member states. Common agricultural policy, I think the optimum club size of the common agricultural policy is somewhere between 0 and 1, right? although there has been some progress in reforming the CAP, I would still say it's a crazy policy. It should not be done by any state. But if the French want to subsidize their farmers, perhaps, from a democratic point of view, they should be allowed to do so, but then also pay for it with their own taxpayers' money. Now, a big thing, of course, is the club of the Eurozone, and there's many theories about the optimum currency area and so on, and I don't want to go into that too far, but I think what we know now is that the Eurozone was too early. There were too many members in the club, and the club constitution didn't work, right? You could get into quite too easily, even by, meddling with the statistics and not really fulfilling the conditions. But once you are there, it's impossible to get out, right? And this kind of situation is a very bad governance structure, as people say today. So this is something which is quite obviously a problem. And to conclude this part of the argument, I think it's quite obvious that one size does not fit all. And quite often the European Union is too large and too deep in its integration, common agricultural policy and the currency union, but also sometimes too small or too shallow, free trade, migration, environment, foreign policy. I think these are areas where we can economically really argue that the EU should do more. And the more people would join the EU in a common effort, the better this would be. And now there are different models, and I won't go through all this. You can find it all in my wonderful paper, perhaps. And it's so the more on the right side you are, the more politically realistic things there are. The status quo is given, and perhaps we get multi-speed integration or concentric circles or enhanced cooperation. And the more blue, or to the left side, these models are, the more reasonable they are in terms of pure economics, but also the more politically naive it would be to think this would ever come about. And so just to give you an idea of this kind of trade-off between what is economically reasonable and what's politically feasible. And one thing that many politicians also today favor, and it's been a rather old discussion, is two-speed Europe, right? You have a pioneer group. Usually it was Germany and France, and we lead the way. And we engage into further integration, further deepening and harmonization and centralization of our policies. And some countries that are simply not willing or too stupid or too poor or whatever to follow us in a way towards the United States of Europe, they can have a grace period, right? They can wait a little, and then we define the rules and you will have to adopt them later. I think it's a rather wicked kind of strategy, because then it does not really solve the problem that I was trying to describe before. It's only temporarily delaying the implementation of some policy. So one size fits all still applies, but only sooner or later. And the pioneers create some fait accompli. They set the agenda, and most likely with the attempt to raise rivals' costs of other members who would then have to follow in their footsteps later on, because they would agree on a high level of regulation and a costly level of regulation. And this would be the one. The other is concentric circles. There you would not have a temporary kind of postponement of complete harmonization and centralization, but you would simply differentiate two different ways of club membership. There's the core members that would agree on, in many policy areas, to go ahead, including a common currency, perhaps a common tax regime, and the others who are incapable or unwilling to do all that, they would be periphery countries, right? And you already understand that some of this already happens today. And perhaps it's not so bad, but I don't think it's the ideal thing to have the ins and outs, like Eurozone members and non-Eurozone members, that would then have to agree on so many other policy areas as well. What you really find, the two before were some kind of academic ideas how to have a somewhat flexible or differentiated integration of the European Union. What you really have in the treaties is a vehicle called enhanced cooperation, where, of course, the status quo is given, but if you have a certain amount of countries who would say this is an area of European integration where we agree and where we want to go forward, then this can be done under these legal circumstances called enhanced cooperation. The strange thing is, why has this instrument not been used much more often? Because it's already there since the late 90s. It has been used for the financial transaction tax lately, for patents and for some divorce arrangements where, the Irish as Catholics or the Poles simply couldn't agree, but the others wanted to have some European-wide kind of understanding about how divorce should be handled when it comes to trans-European marriage. Now, my idea to get to that rather soon is it would be great if we could revise the acquis communautaire, which, as you have seen, includes things where there's no good economic explanation why these policies should be dealt with at a European level. Common agricultural policy, the way the regional policy is handled, for example, social policies and all these things. I think there's really no good argument from an economic or classical liberal point of view why this should be done at the European Union. There are great benefits in terms of trade when it comes to the 4 basic freedoms and so on. But in the other fields, I think these external costs, the differences in preferences between the different countries and their citizens, and also the differences of the ability to implement these common harmonized regulations, they should be an argument for voluntary cooperation of the willing and capable in the policy fields where they see mutual gains from trade, mutual gains from common commitment to a specific policy. That's pretty much the argument, I think. And so you would have what I would then just like to define as a defendable, reasonable common core for European Union politics is where you have really EU-wide public goods, an EU-wide need for internalization, high economies of scale, and low decision-making and external costs, where at least some of these conditions are mostly met. And I think that holds true for, the basic policy with which the EU started. It's the common market. It's with universalizable rules of government behavior, also banning protection and domestic legal privileges, which is what you find in the treaties, and it's one of the great things that occasionally someone in Brussels can tell national governments that they should not subsidize their industry and give special privilege to special rent-seeking groups. At the same time, rent-seeking works pretty well on the level of Brussels itself. So this kind of policy is what Brussels doesn't apply to itself, but imposes on other countries. It's a trade-off kind of thing. But certainly the four basic freedoms: freedom of movement for goods, services, capital, and persons and labor. I think that's one of the greatest achievements, and it's the heart of the European integration project. I would also think that common trade policies and antitrust policies make sense on an EU level. Diplomatic initiatives, more cooperation when it comes to migration problems, I think, is also called for. But for all the rest, you should have something like functionally differentiated integration clubs of the willing and capable. This, to me at least, makes political sense, and one of the advantages is that both of the costs go down. If only the willing and capable are to agree on how they proceed, decision-making costs are not as high as they would otherwise be, and the external costs, the risk to have to accept something that you don't like is very low, because you don't have to join the club if you don't like it. And if you see a club that is really working and think, wow, now I think we can convince people that this experiment works, and this is also how I think the Eurozone should have started, with a very small group, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, and say Finland, and then trying to see how that works in a currency union and with a common currency, and then slowly but surely integrate some other countries, and not have this huge experiment with too many members being involved at the same time and with no procedures for exit and for entry. I think that this kind of flexible enlargement could also lead to a better combination of enlargement, deepening, and a refinement of the policies to be taken in Brussels. You could, for example, think about, at the moment, thing for Turkey is to whether they become a member or not. And for years now we had these negotiations, and they have to check all the boxes before a final agreement can be made, which would most likely be negative anyway. But still, it's take everything or be outside of the European Union. That, I think, doesn't make sense, and I think it would make sense to have free trade with Turkey, which actually is pretty much the case now. It would be funny to have Turkey as a member of the Common Agricultural Policy Club, because economically it would probably break down, which would be a good thing. But this just illustrates what I have in mind, and it could also create this a kind of a institutional competition between clubs. I could even imagine in similar policy areas to have similar European clubs of governments or of nation states that pursue a different line of policy. And then one could compare, there's this kind of yardstick or benchmark competition could be reintroduced into European politics, and competition, as we all know, has two great advantages. It is one of the greatest ways to curb political power, and it is a discovery procedure in sense of Hayek. So many different kinds of political hypotheses or problem solutions can be tested, and on a smaller scale than trying to find the one golden solution for all 28 or soon 30 EU member states. Now, the whole thing, of course, has some problems. It produces challenges, and the biggest one, and this is why I said, to me it makes economic sense, but I also think it's politically naive. The acquis communautaire, all the laws and regulations that we have, or that some governments in the past have agreed on the European stage, it is almost impossible to reform that or to take something back. It's like a ratchet effect, right? You can cede competencies to Brussels, to the European Union, but you will never get them back. Even if people think, oh well, this subsidiarity thing was also might make sense, and perhaps we should give some power back to national parliaments. This is not going to happen, because most of these policies, and especially the policies that do not make much sense economically, are the results of package dealing, of log rolling, where one government was ceding something to the other government, and it's almost impossible politically to unbundle the package and say, well, this part we should agree was not in the benefit of all. And some country would say, yeah, but it is still in the benefit of our people, and that's really the big problem, and that's why I'm rather pessimistic whether this acquis communautaire can ever be reduced. And there are some more problems, perhaps even more chaos in Brussels, but it's not such a crazy vision after all. Here you see a kind of a map of European states and all the different kinds of combinations where they are together and where also other states are part of some European club. There's the Schengen area. Not every EU member state is part of it, and some non-EU member states are part of it. I think that's a smart thing. You can opt in to something without always having to take these decisions. Will we be members of the EU or not? This could also a map that David Cameron might be watching rather soon when it comes closer to the referendum and Brexit. If the UK would leave the EU, it would still be there somewhere, and there's an interesting discussion going on what the costs and benefits of staying and leaving the EU would be, and by leaving, whether to follow something like a Swiss model with bilateral kind of agreements, or a Norwegian model where a country would still have access to the single market, but not be a member of the EU, and so on. So this kind of differentiation and variety and of overlapping integration clubs, I think is a smart idea, and to a certain extent it already is a reality. And I will finish this presentation by quoting this time not Hayek or Rothbard, but another great classical liberal sociologist, Lord Dahrendorf, who has been EU Commissioner and President of the London School of Economics, and a very interesting man, who said, and I quote, "I've often been struck by the prevailing view in EU community circles, that the worst that can happen is any movement towards what is called Europe à la carte. This is not only somewhat odd for someone who likes to make his own choices, but also illustrates that strange puritanism, not to say masochism, which underlies much of community action. Europe has to hurt in order to be good. The European interest," it is said, "is either general or it does not exist. I believe that such a view is not only wrong, but in fact an obstacle to further European integration. Europe à la carte must become the rule rather than the exception if European Union is not to get stuck in a mixture of incomprehensible technicalities, systematic cheating on the part of some, demands for exceptions which destroy overly complex systems, and a sense of frustration and misery all around. I think this is something that Lord Dahrendorf could very easily say today. It reminds him very, very much of certain countries and situations. And so perhaps if my arguments don't convince you, it might be those of Lord Dahrendorf. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. We have time for one or two quick questions. Igor?
What do you make of the proposition that the European Union is a big disenfranchisement of the democratic populace on the national level?
Right.
And if there's something to that, what implications may that have for the political culture in Europe in the long run?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, everyone somehow agrees that there's a democratic deficit, also some problem with the European Union. And the mainstream opinion is if we have this democratic deficit, we should give the European Parliament much more power and try to structure, the EU institutions very much like a nation state. This is not my view. I think the largest part of the democratic deficit is that national parliaments, which are closer to their citizens, have to implement legislation without having an idea or a say in what's really going on. And at least in Germany, it was the case when German taxpayers' money was really promised and to such a huge degree for the bailout programs. And it was the German Constitutional Court that had to remind the German Parliament, you have a certain responsibility for your taxpayers' money. Perhaps you should also take a decision whether to give it away or not. And this is, no taxation without representation and all these basic classical liberal ideas, I think, are being somehow violated when it comes to EU decision-making. And it should be something like a red card. If a certain group of, say, 5 or so national parliaments say, here we think the Commission is about to engage in some regulation where it doesn't have to, subsidiarity principle is violated, we are against, then this should be this should be taken into account. Whereas the European Parliament is always pro more power for Brussels, because it's quite obvious. So I would rather strengthen national parliaments to give a better voice to the citizens of Europe.
Hello, Radovan Jurana. I would like to have a simple question regarding the free trade zone and agricultural subsidies that would be nationalized, not on the European Union level. I often talk to farmers or politicians in Slovakia, and I try to explain them that having it in the EU level, it's very bad. So now let's have this idea that it would be only nationalized. And they ask me, okay, so we let French farmers to subsidize their milk and they will import it to Slovakia. What should I advise to politicians? Like, what should be their proposal in Brussels that we want to change CAP, but we want to let the subsidies in France? I mean, is it compatible, these national subsidies and free trade zone at all?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, when I made this point rather a little bit jokingly, the optimum club size of common agricultural policy could be 1 if the French want to subsidize their own farmers. I was not recommending that French farmers should be specifically subsidized by their own government, because that would create then these distortions in trade and the European market for agricultural products. And that's why I'm certainly not in that sense talking about nationalization of this policy, but privatization of the farming jobs. And so every farmer should try to sell his or her products on the market, and I think we could very well do without subsidies, and in this way also providing much better chances for developing countries to import their goods, which at the at the moment has for decades has become so difficult because we subsidize the European farmers and we erect barriers to trade with them. So just applying the same rules of free trade as applies to cars, and it's hard to find really sectors where there's free trade, even within on the European single market. But at least somewhat close to that ideal would be my idea.
Oh, thanks a lot.
All right, and now we have two short remarks by representatives of two institutions. The first speaker will be Jan Škapa from European Students for Liberty. Jan, now the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would just like to have short remarks about European Students for Liberty. We're a partner for Prague Conference on Political Economy. So one most important thing I want to say is that we are sponsoring, or at least partially sponsoring, tomorrow's social. So there's going to be one free beer per person tomorrow. So I encourage all of you to go to tomorrow's Students for Liberty social here in the wonderful bar at Severo Institute. So this is the most important information for you. Regarding Students for Liberty, we are trying to empower students not only here in the Czech Republic, but also all over Europe and all over the world, actually, to spread the ideas of liberty on their campuses and best to their in the way that's best to their ability. So our organization is doing conferences, also other events, not only here in the Czech Republic, but also all over Europe and all over the world. We just did an amazing conference in Berlin at Humboldt University that was attended by over 500 people and lasted for 3 days, and it was a really, really amazing thing. So if you are a student, if you want to learn more, go to www.studentsforliberty.org, or for the Czech version or Czech group here, www.studentsforlibertycz.cz. Or if you are an alumni or someone who's no longer a student, please tell your pupils about this opportunity to spread the ideas of liberty. Or please also check out the Alumni for Liberty, which is a network of former students that want to connect with pro-liberty people all over the world. So that is all from me. Thank you. I'm very glad that we are a partner here for the Prague Conference on Political Economy, and I'm super excited about Severo and everything that is going on here. So thank you, Professor Shima, and thank you all for coming here.
Thank you, Jan. And indeed, we are always very happy to host Students for Liberty meetings and events. Now, the very last speaker of today is Matt Kwasiborski, who represents TFES, the Fund for American Studies. Matt?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Kwasaborski, and I represent an organization called the Fund for American Studies. We're a higher education nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. And first, I'd like to thank Dr. Shima for giving me this opportunity to speak. I welcome the chance to speak to you all before the dinner. So therefore, if we have about till 7 o'clock, I think we can get through the presentation. I'm kidding. The Fund for American Studies, as mentioned, is a higher education nonprofit organization based upon the founding principles of limited government and free market economics. After the wall came down in 91, we established a program here in Prague in the Czech Republic with a partnership of Charles University called the American Institute on Political and Economic Systems, or APIS. And we've been here since 1993. We've had programs in Hanya in Greece from 1996 to 2012, in Hong Kong starting in 2002, and also in Santiago, Chile, founded in 2009, and also Washington since 1967. My job here in Prague, I'm based here in Prague, so it's a very wonderful city to be here. I've been the director for 10 years now. And we teach 5 subjects during the summer. We bring 110 students from about 35 to 40 different countries. And I just want to give you a brief overview of the academics. The first one is a libertarian perspective on economics, political economy, taught by Dr. Adam Martin of George Mason University and also of Texas Tech. We've had Dr. Pete Betke as a teacher here, Dr. Ed Stringham, Dr. Tom Palmer have all taught in our institutes before. And the idea is basically to teach the students that the more you're willing to trade with your partner, less likely to go to war. Or a quote that's been around, if borders are closed for economic trade, soldiers will enter in, and unfortunately this is happening in part of Europe already, further to the east. Another subject that we teach is political philosophy, where we actually, our professors, Dr. Joshua Mitchell of Georgetown University, is one of the biggest de Tocqueville scholars in the world. He also teaches, looks at stuff even from Karl Marx all the way to de Tocqueville, all the way to Adam Smith, and tries to compare the different philosophies and seeing what de Tocqueville sort of tried to establish through his book, Democracy in America. We also have Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi, who's an American. He teaches conflict management. And the idea there is to remove the students from the conflicts, the emotional side of it, bring them here in Prague and give them more tangible skills. One of the bigger things is that we do a simulation at the Czech Senate here for one day where Dr. Marashi puts the students into different groups and examines real-world situations going on. We can look at what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. We look at ISIS situation down in the Middle East. We look at Israel, Palestine, and things like that. We also have Dr. Pavel Demiš, who was the first foreign minister of Slovakia. He teaches democracies and transitions. The students we serve are from mostly Central and Eastern European, but we also look at the Middle East. We also have students coming from North and South America. We also have Central Asian students. And Dr. Pavel Demiš, being a veteran of the Velvet Revolution here, really has the experience of working with democracies in transition, both back in 1980s, 1990s, and also today, as he works for the European Endowment for Democracy and talks to a lot of people from these countries. So he comes here for a week and gives a seminar for countries that are looking for these struggles, but also enlightens American students on what's really happening in part of the world. One of the benefits you can take away from our program is the students get 6 ECTS credits from Charles University in about 3.5 weeks of work. We also have been around, as I said, since 1993, so we've had over 3,000 students come through our European programs, and we also have a global alumni network of 15,000 people. And that can really help because, as you see today, students have to go to where the jobs are. So maybe they have to leave their homes and go to different cities and different countries, and oftentimes we'll have alumni based there that can either help them get settled or help them get set up professionally like that. We've been very honored to be here in Prague for the last 22 years now. I've been the director since 2005, and right now we're still in our recruiting sessions, starting to do admissions. And if any students here would have any interest, please see me about this. It's an online application that you can find here on our website. It's just tfasinternational.org. We're taking applications until the 1st of May, and we're really trying to push the get more Czech students involved. And even though it's based here in Prague, we really do try to make sure that they don't feel like they're just here in Prague. And my job as director, honestly, it's fantastic to watch 100, 110 students from 35 different countries all come together and realize that this is their only chance to have our experience. And that's the job that me and my staff do. And we really try to make sure that if you're willing to invest the time, that you will get an experience that you will never forget. A lot of programs say this. But I really think that's it, or I still would not be the director after 10 years. So thank you very much, Dr. Shima. I spoke fast because we have to go to dinner now, so but I'll be around for dinner, so if you have any questions, please find me. Thank you.
That's very true. The dinner is next, so for those 20-plus people who registered and paid for the dinner, this is our very final part of today's conference. We will all meet here by the door, let's say at 6:50, and we'll jointly go to the dinner place, which is actually across the street. It's very easy to get there. With the rest of you, I'll see you tomorrow in the morning. We are starting at 9 o'clock. Sessions are held in classrooms here on the first and second floor. Coffee breaks are here and at the bar, which is right this door here. And I look forward very much for a very productive conference. We have a lot of breaks because I understand conferences are not only about presenting your research, but also about talking and networking. So please do it as much as you can, because that is the reason why we annually meet here in Prague. Thank you for being here, and have a nice evening.